We're joined today by Jason Landau Goodman, board chair for the Pennsylvania Youth Congress. For those that are unfamiliar, what is the mission of the Pennsylvania Youth Congress?
Sure. So Pennsylvania Youth Congress was formed almost 15 years ago as Pennsylvania's first and only statewide LGBTQ youth organization. We've also been Pennsylvania's only PA-based statewide LGBTQ advocacy organization in Harrisburg. So basically, we work with many advocates, communities, children, young people, families all across the Commonwealth, helping address LGBTQ public policy through local and state government.
Your website notes that the Pennsylvania Youth Congress does not align with any particular political party or politician. Why is that? We
address our issues and our communities without getting involved in partisan politics, not just as a 501c3, but because we firmly believe that respecting each other, advancing public policy that ensures everyone can thrive should be outside of this back and forth of politics. And we've been very successful at that, especially in local government throughout the Commonwealth, advancing policies through school boards and ultimately in the state legislature, helping bring people together.
Since being sworn into office, President Donald Trump has signed several executive orders, including blocking trans women in high school sports, banning transgender service members in the U.S. military, transferring incarcerated trans women to men's prisons, and blocking federal coverage of gender-affirming health care for minors. How do you address and counter these orders?
We have to deal with each one in its order. There are so many things that are happening right now, and so we have to take each issue one at a time. We try and provide facts to people, particularly just providing stories about what these executive orders mean. Oftentimes, they're really not directly impacting, they're not a law right now. They are essentially a press statement from the current president. And so explaining to folks, until there's a court order, no, you should be proceeding just as you are. Title IX includes LGBTQ protections. That's what the Supreme Court said in the Bostock decision. Those things haven't changed. And so we just have to remain focused, respond to each executive order as it comes, and provide that education and support promoting empathy throughout all of our communities and the Commonwealth and the country, that this division, that this disinformation is not okay, and that we should figure out ways to support folks who are experiencing harm from these policies.
The Pennsylvania Youth Congress has listed an agenda of its policy issues and priorities. The top one on the list is non-discrimination protections based on gender identity and sexual orientation. What, if any, protections currently exist in Pennsylvania statute?
Sure. So Pennsylvania is fascinating in so many ways. We do not have explicit statewide protections under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act of 1955. It protects across a number of classes, but sexual orientation or gender identity are not currently included explicitly. The Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission several years ago put forward through regulation that sex discrimination includes sex stereotyping, which is what came out of the Supreme Court decision in Bostock, saying that sexual orientation and gender identity are currently existing classes under sex. So by application, we currently have LGBTQ non-discrimination protections, and people are filing complaints with the Human Relations Commission to seek relief from discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations. However, that is not as stable as an actual statute or ultimately constitutional protections. So since 1982, we've had local governments across Pennsylvania adopt local ordinances, local non-discrimination ordinances. So the first one was in Philadelphia, then Harrisburg. I worked on one in my hometown in Lower Merion Township. We were the first in my county and the first township in the state to put one forward. But we have 75 local governments. That's more than any other state in the country that have passed these explicit local protections. So 4 counties, 71 municipalities, covering about 38% of the state's population, having explicit protections under law for sexual orientation and gender identity protections. And that's not even to mention the school districts, which we might get to in a few minutes.
We will. Pennsylvania Youth Congress is also calling for an update to Pennsylvania's hate crime statutes. Why is this a particular area of concern for the LGBTQ community?
Hate crimes laws are generally premised on criminal enhancements following a conviction. And so it's important that we put out there, if we have a hate crimes statute, an ethnic intimidation law in Pennsylvania, that it includes sexual orientation and gender identity. It sends the message out there that if you attack someone explicitly, again, based in hate, that you are not just, we're addressing that you just did not attack one victim, but you've attacked an entire community. And that's the sense of justice that is needed in those moments. But we have to do so much more than just punitive hate crimes laws in that way. We have to provide more victim services. We have to provide more education to prevent these acts of violence. We have to provide more restorative justice practices. There's a whole host of issues that should be addressed when it comes to preventing and providing justice with acts of violence against LGBTQ people. Particularly trans people and trans women of color are especially at risk for violence, and that violence should have no place in our society.
Since you mentioned it, the Ethnic Intimidation Act was updated in 2002 to apply to members of the LGBTQ community. What happened to the statute?
I actually think this is it's an unfortunate moment in Pennsylvania history. We did pass that law in 2002, but it was unfortunately struck down by state courts due to a technicality on how it was advanced through the legislature. It had nothing to do with the content. However, in 2002, and my hometown state rep at the time was very involved in this, Lita Cohen, you had a Republican House and a Republican Senate passing an LGBT rights law signed into law by a Republican governor. It was we are the first state in the country that is noted to have passed an LGBT rights law with a Republican trifecta. We have done this in the past, addressing issues impacting LGBTQ folks regardless of political party, but the past 10 years have been increasingly difficult, but we're not giving up. LGBTQ people are in every community across the Commonwealth, in every political party, every neighborhood, every school, and so we exist, and we have to have these conversations to address violence, to address safety, equal protection, and ultimately the positive work to make sure that everyone can thrive.
What actions are being taken to get the state legislature to revisit at the Ethnic Intimidation Act, as well as just hate crime statutes in general?
Sure. So at least right now we've seen the House with its current leadership have an interest in moving this legislation. And so they have moved several bills in the last session. When we're expecting in this session, they will do so again. In a divided government, it's extremely hard to try and bring people together. We have to continue to provide the education to lawmakers, continuing to encourage folks to contact their legislators saying, this is beyond political football. Please address violence against LGBTQ people. Please address equal protection under the law. Those are important conversations to have to provide the real lived experiences of LGBTQ people in their communities with their lawmakers and saying, this is not right. Please fix this. They have the power, especially for hate crimes. It's been done before in Pennsylvania. Their predecessors, most of them voted for this. And so trying to make sure people are coming together. One bill, for example, that was passed in the House last session was marriage equality. While we do have marriage equality through a federal court ruling in Pennsylvania in 2014 and the U.S. Supreme Court in 2015, we still have an outdated part of the statute that prohibits marriage equality. And so having legislation to correct that is important. Part of the conversation, I think many people want to address non-discrimination protections first, but for that bill, there were dozens of Republican legislators, and I believe every Democratic House member voted for it. So people came together in a bipartisan way to advance these issues. So that's what we're doing right now, is providing that education, trying to bring people together on the issues that we can agree upon.
On perhaps a related topic, you're seeking a ban on the gay and trans panic defense in courts. Can you talk a little bit about this, and does this ban exist in other states?
Yes, so there's a number of other states that have passed this, and it essentially says that it is not a proper legal argument when someone has been charged with particularly a homicide charge to say that it is acceptable for them to have committed that murder because the person was LGBTQ. They got into a panic because they were not aware of that person's identity. And that is so dehumanizing. We just last summer had the horrible tragedy of a 14-year-old named Polly Likens out in Mercer County who was murdered by a much older man, and it was a horrific crime. And the district attorney up there and his office are doing an excellent job at prosecuting that case. They caught the person who essentially we know committed this crime, and he does not have the power to advance hate crimes protections under current state statute. So luckily, this person has not alleged a transpanic defense in court that we've seen so far. But that is the type of situation that we want to avoid. And so that is part of the portfolio of the issues that we're addressing.
Another priority is seeking protections for members of the LGBTQ community that are in correctional facilities. Can you talk about what specific protections you're seeking at this time?
Sure. Those who are incarcerated are some of are in particularly hard positions. They are doing their time to pay for the crimes that they've been convicted of. But we are, in our society, humane, as we are trying to be humane. I think that's what most people want. We do not want people to be suffering extra harms in prison. Generally speaking, it's not acceptable. Folks need their medication. If they're diabetics, they need access to certain healthcare options. And so whether it's commissary or just placement, folks who are incarcerated currently, whether it's a county jail or a state prison or even a federal prison, should be able to be safe and not incredibly victimized for additional violence, sexual assault. That's not what we should be allowing to exist. And that's why additional protections are needed, explicit protections that say, LGBTQ people are not just automatically subjecting to solitary confinement because of their status. Those are the things that do need to be spelled out because they do happen, and it is not what we should be doing.
Another item on the agenda focuses on HIV criminalization. Can you talk a little bit about how state statute currently criminalizes people that are living with HIV?
Sure. So we're actually ahead of a number of states which did at some point pass more extreme HIV criminalization bills into law, including several of our neighboring states, and they have since reversed that. We only have 2 specific criminalization statutes on the books right now related to those who have HIV, those who are sex workers and those who are currently incarcerated. And so Representative Ben Waxman and other legislators have been recently introducing legislation to remove those specific mentions of HIV status for additional criminal penalties.
In 2022, Governor Tom Wolf called for a ban on conversion therapy. Several licensing boards have also condemned the practice on minors. What more would you like to see done?
There needs to be an actual explicit ban. We're appreciative of Governor Wolf and Governor Shapiro going as far as they can under their authority and the state boards. But essentially, their power is right now to discourage the practice. We need an absolute explicit ban on any attempt by a medical professional, a healthcare professional, to try and change someone's immutable characteristic, their sexual orientation or their gender identity for minors. This is for minors. And so that practice does happen on occasion in Pennsylvania, and it should happen nowhere in Pennsylvania or this country.
For those that are not familiar, what's involved in that practice?
In the far past, this practice might have involved electroshock therapy. Oftentimes it's counseling, and I'm not an expert in all of the mental health care terminology, but certainly there are practices, exposure therapy, ways to try and encourage someone to change who they are inside. It doesn't work. It's discredited by every major medical organization. And it's a cruel way to start out your life, to being told by adults that you don't exist, you shouldn't exist, and we're going to change you. It does not work, and many lives have been harmed by it.
We're also seeking for reproductive freedom for all, regardless of sexual orientation. What kind of statute would you like to see regarding this?
Sure. There's a number of statutes in this area, and so we look to reproductive justice organizations to help lead that charge, but we support all of the efforts to make sure that folks who need reproductive health care have access to it. This includes anything from making sure fertility care is accessible to potentially like a lesbian couple that might want to have children. They should be guaranteed non-discrimination protections in going to a healthcare facility to have IVF. There are so many issues in this area, but we support people having bodily autonomy in all the ways that you should.
We talked a little earlier about non-discrimination, but particularly with schools, how would you like to see schools address particularly issues of bullying and violence?
Sure. There's several things that schools should do. Certainly they should update their policies, but policy is not enough. We need them to enforce those policies, people to be aware of those policies, and provide education to change school culture, particularly for LGBTQ students who are at heightened risk for violence and assault and bullying and harassment. We need the protected classes to be enumerated in the non-discrimination policies, in the anti-harassment and anti-bullying policies. It's really difficult when we see, and it's oftentimes in the news, and it's very difficult for students to go to school, LGBTQ students to go to schools that are in districts that have passed anti-LGBTQ policies. Those encourage harassment, bullying, and violence. We only know, we inventory all 500 school districts across the state and their policies of about 20 school districts, which is still, should be no school districts passing anti-trans particularly policies. But we have over 120 school districts that have passed explicitly supportive protections based on gender identity. So we have more school districts that are passing policies to support LGBTQ students. At the local level, I think that's where we have to start, but ultimately we need state policies to require uniform protections, uniform standards of anti-bullying policies. Really, the legislature in 2008 said all school districts are required to have an anti-bullying policy, but didn't really detail what needs to be in there. What's the accountability for the school? What's the opportunity for reporting for students? And all the things to make sure that every student is focused on getting education and not worried about being attacked in the hallway.
Could you talk a little bit about seeking sexual health and relationship education in schools, and in particular in an area when there's some parents that have concerns and sensitivity over what they want particularly younger children to be exposed to?
Sure. So this is about where the baseline is in our society. Are we saying that in schools we're teaching factual history, factual health education, including sexual health education? And if we are, that's what we should be doing. School districts already have extensive policies on how parents and guardians should be able to review all matters of curricula and how they can remove their child from those lessons. And that happens. The negative movements that are happening out there to try and just outright ban LGBTQ related content or content related to sexual health education in general from schools isn't really appropriate. Communities should be providing accurate healthcare information to young people. I know I received that education when I was in middle school, and that was extremely helpful. Every student should be presented with the opportunity to learn about the world, learn about their health. And if parents or guardians want to make the choice to remove their students from that, they already do.
In an era where there are school boards having fights and court battles over book bans in particular, are there other areas of educational curriculum that you'd like to see inclusion?
Sure. I mean, it is an interesting time. We've recently had a federal court decision from the Western District of Pennsylvania, the Tattle decision, which was several parents suing the Mount Lebanon School District, where they alleged that, and I'm summarizing here, essentially a teacher mentioning gender identity in a public school was not explicitly in the curriculum. And so they said basically that was not right, and that federal court agreed, and they settled the case following that, just at the district court level. But if that's a tone from one court, we want to be aware that yes, school districts should be explicitly saying that we are teaching about inclusion for all people. This is the real world, and all people are in it, and you should be encouraged to treat people with dignity and respect and kindness. That shouldn't be so off-putting for anyone.
We had talked a little bit briefly about President Donald Trump's orders, in particular related to schools. The PIAA last month revised their transgender policy in accordance with Donald Trump's order, not allowing trans women or girls in girls' high school sports. Can you talk a little bit about how you address this issue?
Sure. So, I mean, this is a big issue, and it's been made a big issue. It's not our number one issue. We don't want anyone to be discriminated in any capacity. So certainly, this conversation has been brought to the front. But I want to be clear that we want to talk about the positive work to advance non-discrimination protections. But this issue is not essentially about sports. It's about delegitimizing the human being, a human being who is transgender. And so this is where they're starting. They're saying, well, if they're different in this area, then they're different in that area. And then we can take that protection away and that protection away. And so this is the first step. If we're talking about issues in sports, we should be bringing together athletic professionals and healthcare providers and science and facts. Instead, it's being pushed by millions of dollars from politics, from organizations that have been designated hate groups. That's where the conversation is being pushed forward, and it has gotten into the public domain where people are actively talking about these issues. There are very few trans students who are participating in school sports in Pennsylvania. They've done so really without, we have not heard of a single issue in Pennsylvania. The mixed gender policy from PIAA was instituted in 2014, which essentially leaves the decision-making power of a student's gender to the school. The PIAA recently just changed the word gender to sex in accordance with the new president's executive order. Again, they weren't forced by a court to do that. They just are doing pre-compliance, which we are very concerned with. But it still remains the decision of a school on the participation of trans students. And so we're seeing school districts that have already on the books protections for gender identity. How are they going to relate to this change in PIAA? We don't know how this part of it's going to play out, but currently we do have protections. Trans students, LGBTQ students should have equal protection in their public schools, and that includes all parts of their public school. So I hope that people, sit down, learn, listen about these issues, which there's so much disinformation about, and not just, continuing to hammer on the trans young people who deserve so much better in our society today than to be reduced to something so cruel in national politics.
The Pennsylvania Youth Congress is also seeking to streamline the process to change one's name. Can you talk a little bit about why this is such an important issue for the LGBTQ community and perhaps some of the difficulties that they currently encounter?
Sure. So for many trans and gender expansive folks, they do need to update their documentation if their sex marker or their name designated at birth does not match their gender identity. And so in Pennsylvania, we do have an antiquated system where you do have to go to a court to petition them to show you're not trying to evade, a debt collector or anything like that, and a judge has to sign off. It's very expensive. There's publication requirement. Number of trans folks have been able to get that publication requirement waived because it puts them specifically at risk for harm or violence if people are seeing their name in the newspaper. And so we encourage this system to be reformed. All people, might be anyone might be a person who wants to seek a name change in Pennsylvania. It should be really more of an administrative process. If there's an administrative judge sitting in Harrisburg processing them, and if there's questions, then yes, you might want to have a judge review the case, but it's very intensive right now. And so if you're an individual who just got married, but it's been years since you got married and you want to change your last name, and there's all sorts of situations in which you might want to change your name, and to be dragged through months and months of an expensive process, it should just be easier for everyone. This isn't an LGBTQ specific issue, but it's a state government issue in which we hope that legislators will address.
In 2016, the Pennsylvania Youth Congress identified a listing of Pennsylvania high school mascots that they deemed as anti-Native American. Can you talk a little bit about why this issue has come to your attention?
Sure. So actually, we were inventorying all 500 school district policies, as we do every few years, and we noticed that there were several school districts, several dozen in fact, that had quite offensive names. And I know that, there are many folks out there who feel very attached to those names, but we, sit and listen to Native Americans and many other folks who are feel very dehumanized by those mascots, coming from essentially a place of white supremacy, that we should not be having school mascots portrayed as caricatures of Native Americans, not in 2025. And so we decided, as far back as 2016, to just, post the list. It's been fascinating. It's one of the most visited websites on the web pages on the Pennsylvania Youth Congress website. People from across the country come and see, what's the status in Pennsylvania? Because there's, limited information. I guess because we're the policy nerds and we do inventory that, and we did put it in one place. But still, this is part of the conversation. Is how do we make schools safer for all young people? How would you feel if you were a Native young person in a school in rural Pennsylvania or in a city, because these mascots exist in various places, but just you're there, you're one of probably very few Native students, and you just see in the wall a caricature of your culture and your people. That's not very nice, and that should be weighted more than, we've had this mascot for 50 years. Well, it's only been 50 years. We can change it to something more exciting and safer for students.
As we speak in March of 2025, the legislative session is in full swing. What will you and the Pennsylvania Youth Congress do to further your agenda moving forward?
Sure. We do what we've done for almost 15 years, which is provide education to lawmakers, creating an atmosphere where people are coming together. I know that's very hard these days, and we're not naive about it. But we still show up every session day that we can to say, hey, let's figure these issues out. Let's advance smart public policy. And many legislators, they tell us about their LGBTQ families, regardless of political party, LGBTQ members of their family. And so, there is a common starting place of, how do we address these issues? But it is extremely difficult in the political climate we find ourselves in. But we're not by any means taking any steps back in Pennsylvania. We're continuing to move forward in a positive direction, and that's what we will continue to do.
Jason Landau Goodman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.